Joseph Abbeel's memoir offers a riveting glimpse into the life of a Flemish horseman conscripted into Napoleon's Grand Army. This is the 9th episode. We find Abbeel leaving Moscow. Let's begin. After following the main road from Moscow to Smolensk for several days, we arrived in the latter city on November 10th or 11th. On November 6th and 7th, when we were still 20 hours walk from Smolensk, we had already lost a third of our army due to the cold and other misfortunes. After leaving Smolensk, the indescribable hunger forced us to leave the road and search for food in remote villages, where we ran a great risk of losing our lives. Although we had no other choice, I would rather have died of hunger on the main road than have voluntarily surrendered to the executioners. For I was sure that of 100 soldiers who left the road, 99 would be hanged by the peasants or deprived of life in an even crueler manner. So I continued to follow the road to Borisov, while I could think of nothing else but that at any moment I would serve as carrion for the crows or dogs, which we saw all day on the bodies of those who had succumbed and were frozen along the road. But God decided otherwise, for after a long journey I reached the Berezina river, where part of our army had set up to protect the retreat. It waited for the baggage wagons and wounded returning from Moscow to cross the bridges. Afterward, it would burn the bridges. Seeing that military force of perhaps some 60,000 armed men, I took heart, thinking that the enemy would have to stop there and that we could then proceed at our leisure. I hurried to cross the bridge, for I intended to rest a bit on the other side and roast the piece of horse meat I had with me. Since more than 6 weeks, horse meat had been my daily food. Because the enemy had pursued us constantly, I had had to march day and night, which had greatly fatigued me. Once on the other side, I decided to spend the night there. It was very cold, and to make matters worse, on November 26th and 27th, the days I arrived, so much snow fell that the earth was covered at least 2 feet deep. Roads and ditches could no longer be distinguished, and it was freezing hard. Although the river was wide and had a strong current, it froze over that night. Emperor Napoleon had his headquarters at Eylau, on his side of the river. On the other side were Prince Poniatowski, Marshal Ney, and other generals with their troops, mostly consisting of Polish lancers, carabinier, and cuirassiers. Napoleon foresaw that they would not be able to hold back the enemy army for long. Therefore, he ordered several cannons to be set up by the river, at a place where the bank was very steep and where it was impossible for the enemy to cross the watercourse. Earlier, he had ordered 2 bridges to be built, a pontoon bridge and a pile bridge. So said, so done. Everyone got to work. The pontooniers jumped into the water, which came up to their necks and in which many ice floes floated. While the cry "Long live the Emperor" sounded for Napoleon was watching, they worked diligently. As a result, the bridges were soon ready for crossing. The pile bridge was used for the crossing of cannons, ammunition wagons, carriages, and cavalry, while the other was for the infantry. Initially, the crossing was disciplined, but around 8 o'clock in the morning, the enemy army appeared in large numbers on the plain on the other side of the river. This caused great fear among those still on that side. Everyone hurried to the bridges, running or riding to cross them. Meanwhile, our cavalry made a charge on the enemy, where one fell with his horse into a ditch, another somewhere in a pit, for the snow made ditches and pits indistinguishable. Nevertheless, everyone fought as hard as they could, and everywhere the cry "Long live the Emperor" echoed through the air. Yes, the French fought so fiercely that one may say in their honor that no one, whoever it may be, has ever seen troops fight more bravely. But what good did it do? Their numbers dwindled visibly, with no hope of reinforcement. The enemy army, on the other hand, swelled from minute to minute, as fresh troops arrived from all sides, and eventually, our soldiers had to give way. The enemy saw that the French were fleeing and bravely pursued them. Then one saw riders, infantry, carts, carriages, cannons, ammunition wagons, sutlers, and other people with baggage wagons, all and everyone running and riding as fast as possible to cross the bridges at the same time. But alas, it was all in vain, for in the bridge intended for vehicles, large holes had formed due to the heavy traffic. The wagons got their wheels entangled, while the enemy approached and fired thousands of cannonballs at the bridges. This caused many deaths and injuries, with the dead and injured remaining piled on top of each other. The others killed each other to climb over these dead and injured at all costs. The soldiers on this side of the river saw that it would not be long before the enemy would also cross the bridge. To prevent that, they set the bridge on fire. Everyone on the bridge fell into the water. The French who were still on the other side tried to cross via the ice, but it was not strong enough to bear such a large number of wagons, carriages, horses, and people. The ice cracked, and everyone drowned with horse and tail. Yes, even some generals and other great men met this fate. While the bridges were burning, the enemy was heavily bombarded with the cannons set up on this side of the river. The Russians lost so many people that they were eventually forced to retreat. The slaughter caused by both sides was so great and so cruel that one could only think that the end of the world had arrived, for one comrade murdered another. I even saw a cuirassier who lay under his fallen horse and begged everyone who passed by for help. When he saw that all his comrades remained deaf to his pleas, he stuck his fingers in his mouth and bit them off. Thousands of other cruelties and atrocities occurred there. There was wailing, groaning, shouting, and cursing. The river was crammed full of dead bodies, and the stench of burnt bodies was unbearable. Everything I had seen up to that point was mere child's play compared to this. However, since I am not capable of describing what was there to be seen, I want to leave the blood-red river behind me and continue my journey. Together with a large number of wounded men, I left that place at dusk, while the rest of the army stayed there overnight. We traveled day and night to stay ahead of the enemy. Along the way, we ate nothing but our usual food, but even that became scarcer by the day. Whenever a horse fell, we had to pounce on it with force to secure a piece of meat. After a long and arduous journey, we finally reached Mshislau, where I happened by chance to meet 6 carabiniers whom I knew. But before we got there, I had seen thousands of unfortunate comrades succumb to hunger and cold along the way, without feeling any form of compassion for them. Yes, we had banished the feeling of compassion so far from our hearts that nothing in the world could make any impression on us. For every 10 steps we took, we encountered new horrors. The road was strewn with dead bodies that ravens and dogs were feasting on. Even among comrades who had been traveling together for a long time in pairs or threes, one saw that one robbed the other of his clothes and left him naked if the other fell by accident or from weakness. Sometimes we passed a place where part of the army had bivouacked. There we saw thousands of soldiers who had frozen to death around extinguished campfires or sitting by them. Others had fallen into the fire from weakness or the cold and were completely burned. If the bivouac had not been abandoned by the army too long ago, we sought out still burning fires and then feasted on the porridge that had been made there, but which they had not had time to eat. This porridge was a kind of batter, made from melted snow and rye flour. It was black-gray in color due to the dirty snow water and because it was salted with the powder from the cartridges, but it tasted good to me. This soldier's fare was often the only thing there was. Every soldier was therefore equipped with a double bag or beesass that he tied around his shoulders, containing a supply of flour. Because the horrors we encountered along the way are too dreadful to describe, I will now continue with my departure from Mshislau. After spending the night in this city, we set off, 7 of us, determined to support each other to our last breath. We sought our way through forests and along back roads, hoping to find help somewhere, as we were all tired of living in such great misery. After possibly traversing the forests for 5 to 6 hours without seeing anyone, we came upon a cottage that stood alone in the middle of the forest. All 7 of us entered and demanded bread from the host, but he did not understand us. Since we noticed that all the people in the house were afraid of us, we went to the pantry and took what pleased us. Cheerfully, we continued on our way. We walked and slept in the forests for 7 days. At our sleeping places, we dared not make a fire, fearing that peasants might attack and kill us during the night. One day we had bread and the next day not, as we only dared to ask for or take bread in houses that were far from others. Sometimes we had bread in our knapsack, but still suffered from hunger because the bread was frozen and harder than bone. After 7 days, we finally arrived at a village in the evening. Since the weather was not fit for man or beast to sleep outside, we decided to take our chances and stay there overnight. Together, we entered the first house we came across. The owner asked what we wanted, but we did not understand him, and he did not understand us. Therefore, we led him by gestures to a barn, shook open bundles of straw, and lay down on them, which he seemed to allow. Then we took wood and made a good fire in the middle of this kind farmer's yard. We sat around it with the farmer. We gestured to him that we would like something to eat. Immediately, he brought out an earthenware pot, they did not know iron or copper pots there, filled with some turnips, carrots, and salt. At this scene, we exclaimed, "Dobre, dobre, gospoda," which meant, "Good, good, sir." We immediately set to work. One fetched water, another peeled and scraped the turnips and carrots, and a third, a certain Minin from Gale near Antwerp, went to the barn to prepare our straw bed while we cooked the soup. Meanwhile, the pigs were being led home from the forests. In this country, someone is appointed in each village to herd the pigs, both in summer and winter, and bring them back to the village in the evening. One of these pigs entered the barn where Minin was opening bundles of straw. Minin grabbed a large piece of wood, struck the pig dead with it, covered it with straw, and then came and sat with us, saying nothing about the incident. Some time later, a farmer, the owner of the pig, came onto the yard. He asked if we had seen his pig, but we did not understand him. He went to look for the pig and found it under the straw. He went to get other farmers and returned with at least 100 men, all armed with long sticks and bellowing like bears. They surrounded us from all sides. From their gestures, we understood that they intended to beat us to death, burn us, hang us, or cut off our heads with a knife. We watched the farmers pacing back and forth, not understanding what was happening, although we suspected they were waiting for a baron or some lord. We sat around our fire, as pale as white linen, looking at each other, not daring to stand up and not knowing what they wanted from us, as Minin had still not told us anything. After they had stood around us for a long time, yelling, screaming, and spitting in our faces, the baron came onto the yard with even more farmers. He looked even more cruel than his subjects. Yes, we almost fainted when he approached us and looked at us. He addressed us in a barbaric manner, but we gestured that we did not understand him. We could tell that the farmers were constantly asking for our execution. Then he asked, "Isn't there one among this group who can speak German?" I replied that I was German. He asked me why we had killed the pig. I told him that I did not even know why the farmers were wailing so. I also said that if the animal had been killed by one of us, it was because of our great poverty. I briefly told him all our woes and misery. "Yes," he said, "but why did you go with those French scoundrels and robbers?" And he pointed to my comrades, to Moscow. I replied that the French ruled over our lands and that we were forced to obey them, against our will. "But," he said, laughing, "these peasants are asking me to hang or burn you all, as punishment for your crimes here. However, if you give 8 rubles to the owner of the pig, no harm will come to you." Hastily and gladly, we collected this amount, after which the baron sent the farmers home. After this incident, we went to our barn. We left the soup, for we had lost the appetite to eat it. We closed the barn door and lay down as quietly as mice, without speaking or squeaking, in the straw, frightened that the peasants might still return that night to kill us. It was a great fortune that the baron spoke German, but it was an even greater fortune that our comrade Ledrison, who was from Rumbeck near Menin, was ill at the time. Otherwise, he would not have been able to restrain himself and would have attacked the farmers, even though there were many of them and we were all unarmed and wounded. Only one of us could still use both hands, but he had received a bullet through his neck and throat. This Ledrison, whom I mention here, was so bold that during the march to Moscow, he often went on looting expeditions entirely alone. Armed only with his carbine, he ventured 4 to 5 hours' walk from our bivouac. After spending the entire night on a looting expedition, he often returned to the bivouac by morning with 10 to 12 peasants, all laden with provisions. He was cruel by nature, but also very generous, as will be read later in this account. At daybreak, we left our barn and ventured back into the woods, determined not to spend the night in villages again. As soon as we were in the woods, Ledrison started cursing. He swore that he would kill the first peasant he encountered to avenge what the other peasants had done. We laughed at him, thinking he did not mean it. "Last night I was so frightened," he said, "that I have become perfectly healthy today." When we had walked about a mile into the woods, we saw a peasant approaching us in the distance. As soon as Ledrison noticed him, he gestured to us that he had to pull down his pants. He walked into the bushes and we continued walking calmly. The peasant passed us, wishing us a good day, and we no longer thought about what Ledrison had said. After walking a bit further, we looked back to see if Ledrison was following us. We then saw the peasant lying on the ground, while our guy was bent over him, continuously hitting him with a large stick he had cut from the bushes instead of pulling down his pants. We walked over to them, but by the time we arrived, the Russian had already passed on to eternity. Afterward, we continued our journey until we eventually came to a meadow where many horses were grazing. We each took a horse and soon rode on. To control the horses, we had nothing but a cord, with which the 2 front legs of the animals were tied together to prevent them from running away from the meadow. In haste, we fashioned a bridle out of this. In this manner, we traveled for another 10 days, feeding the horses with the hay we found in the woods. Eventually, we arrived at the battlefield of Vitebsk, where we were back on familiar ground for the first time since the beginning of our 10-day journey through the woods. The bodies of the soldiers who had fallen there 3 months earlier were still all there, and the stench was horrific. Most of the corpses were so crushed by the wheels of the cannons that one could hardly tell they had once been human. We were glad to be back on the main road and became bolder. On the battlefield, we took abandoned wagons, harnessed 3 horses to each wagon, and rode comfortably to the city of Vitebsk, which was full of wounded. There, for the first time, we bought bread from one of the many Jews living there. Without them, no Frenchman returning from Moscow would have survived. After we got our bread, we rode to a beautiful house and stayed there overnight. By accident, I lost there the cartridge, paper sleeve with powder, that had been in my hand for 15 days and had been removed in Moscow. This concludes the 9th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. What do you think of Abbeel's adventures? Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.